at 2:17 on a road outside Chartres. At 2:17 in the morning, on August 29, 1944, somewhere along the dark road between Chartres and Dreux, a U.S. Army truck driver from a quartermaster truck company leaned forward over the wheel of a 2.5-ton GMC, trying not to blink too long. The headlights were hooded. The road ahead was not really visible, only suggested. A strip of black surface, a pale shoulder, the dim shape of another truck moving ahead like a shadow with weight. Behind him, the cargo bed was stacked with 5-gallon gasoline cans, lashed down with rope, metal knocking against metal every time the truck hit a rut. The smell was heavy. Oil, hot rubber, old sweat, canvas, gasoline fumes leaking from cans that had been filled too quickly and handled too roughly. He had been told not to stop. That was the rule. Keep moving. Stay in line. Do not break the convoy. Do not turn on full lights. Do not fall asleep. Do not lose the road. Do not lose the cargo. Somewhere far ahead, armored units were waiting for fuel. Not in a dramatic way. Not like a scene in a newsreel with flags and cheering villagers. They were waiting in the blunt, dangerous way armies wait when their engines are cooling, their maps are spread open, and every officer knows that a tank without gasoline is no longer a weapon. It is steel left in the wrong place. The driver could feel the wheel tremble under his palms. The tires were worn. The suspension groaned. Every few minutes, the convoy slowed, and red brake lights were not allowed to flare normally in the darkness. Men watched one another by instinct and fear. One truck braking too late could fold into another. One driver drifting off could send thousands of pounds of fuel into a ditch. One mistake could burn men alive before anyone understood what had happened. There were no enemy tanks in front of him. No German infantry visible in the hedgerows. No artillery shells landing close enough to count. But the danger was there in another form. In the exhaustion behind his eyes. In the narrowness of the road. In the engine heat. In the cargo. In the knowledge that this same run might have to be made again tomorrow, and the next day and the day after that until the war either moved forward or stopped. This was the Red Ball Express. It did not look like a weapon. That was why many people misunderstood it. To the men at the front, war had a recognizable shape. Tanks, rifles, artillery, aircraft, mud on boots, smoke over towns, the sound of shells passing overhead. To commanders, war appeared in arrows on maps, in divisions and corps, in dates and objectives. To the public back home, war was often remembered through landings, battles, generals, and ruined cities. But in France in late summer 1944, the war was also a road. A road crowded with trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, tires, medical supplies, and everything else an army consumed faster than civilians could imagine. The Germans had seen armies outrun themselves before. They knew the shape of overextension. They had done it in Russia. They had felt it in North Africa. They understood that victory could bleed to death quietly, not because the enemy fought better, but because a unit needed fuel and the fuel was 50 miles behind it. Then 100. Then 200. So when Allied armored columns broke out of Normandy and began racing across France, some German officers looked at the speed and saw danger for the Allies, not only for themselves. They believed the Allied armies would stretch too far. They believed the advance would choke on its own momentum. They believed gasoline and ammunition would become invisible walls stronger than concrete. For a while, that belief made sense. The French rail network had been shattered. Bridges were down. Ports were limited. Roads were damaged, crowded, and often poorly marked. Supplies were piling up near Normandy while the front ran east. The faster Allied troops moved, the farther they moved from the things that kept them alive. And yet, on roads like this one outside Chartres, men kept driving. They were not famous men. Many were black American soldiers serving in a segregated army that asked them to carry the burden of victory while refusing them equal dignity. Many were mechanics, loaders, dispatchers, military policemen, and drivers whose names would never appear beside Patton, Bradley, Montgomery, or Eisenhower. They did not speak in grand phrases. They checked tires. They tightened ropes. They wiped dust from their eyes. They climbed back into trucks. The driver at 217 did not need a speech about history. He needed the truck ahead of him not to vanish into the dark. He needed the engine not to fail. He needed his own body to remain awake just a little longer. Behind him, the gasoline cans rattled again. Ahead, the convoy moved. And far beyond that dark road, German units were beginning to discover that the Allied advance had a second engine, one they had not properly feared. But before German lines began starving, before the Red Ball Express became a symbol of relentless American supply, there was a belief held in German headquarters and, quietly, in some Allied offices too. The belief was simple. The trucks would not be enough. The German bet. Let them outrun themselves. By late August 1944, the German army in France was no longer fighting the war it had planned to fight. Normandy had broken open. The hedgerow battles had consumed men, machines, time, and nerve. Then the front cracked. Allied armor poured through. Towns that German officers had expected to defend became names passed too quickly over radio nets. Columns retreated under pressure from the ground and from the air. Roads filled with vehicles, horses, wounded men, staff cars, fuel trucks, artillery pieces, and abandoned equipment left where engines failed or drivers panicked. But even in retreat, German officers could still reason. They could still read a map. They could still recognize a problem. The Allied advance was fast. Too fast, some believed. Every mile eastward stretched the Allied supply line. Every tank that moved forward needed fuel moved forward behind it. Every artillery barrage fired shells that had to be replaced. Every infantry battalion required food, ammunition, medical supplies, radio batteries, boots, spare weapons, and transport. The faster the front moved, the more violent the appetite became. German commanders understood this because Germany had learned the lesson in cruel places. In the Soviet Union, panzers had driven deep into spaces that seemed to grow larger with every advance. Roads turned into mud. Rail gauges did not match. Horses died. Trucks broke. Fuel columns lagged. A spearhead could win a battle and still lose its strength because supply could not follow. In North Africa, desert distances and fuel shortages had shaped entire campaigns. A commander might be brilliant, aggressive, adored by propaganda, and still be stopped by empty tanks. So German confidence in late summer 1944 was not pure fantasy. It had logic behind it. They believed the Allied armies were being pulled forward by success faster than their logistics could sustain. They believed the ports were too few, the railways too damaged, the beaches too far behind. They believed Allied commanders, intoxicated by the pursuit, would discover that movement itself could become a trap. On a headquarters map, the idea looked almost reasonable. Let the Allies race. Let their fuel consumption rise. Let their trucks wear out. Let their armored columns outrun their depots. Then, when the momentum failed, German forces could regroup behind rivers, towns, and defensive lines. The Allies would arrive breathless, undersupplied, frustrated. No longer a flood, but a series of exposed spearheads. There were moments when this seemed close to happening. American armored units did pause for fuel. Patton's Third Army, moving with frightening speed, developed a hunger no supply officer could ignore. Gasoline became more than a commodity. It became permission. Permission to attack. Permission to exploit. Permission to keep pressure on a retreating enemy before he could form a new line. Without fuel, the most aggressive commander in Europe could only wait. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a mechanized unit when engines stop for the wrong reason. It is not peace. It is anxiety. Tank crews sit on steel hulls and look down roads. Drivers check gauges they already know are low. Officers ask questions to which everyone knows the answer. Men smoke too much. Radios crackle. Somewhere, a staff officer calculates distance, consumption, and time, and the numbers do not feel friendly. The Germans were counting on that silence spreading. But their belief contained a blind spot. They saw Allied logistics as a tail, something behind the real animal, slow and vulnerable, dragged along by the fighting units. They did not fully see that the Allies were beginning to turn that tail into a weapon. Not elegant, not clean, not free of failure, but massive, improvised, and relentless. The Red Ball Express emerged from that emergency. It was not born from luxury or perfect planning. It was born because the front was moving and the supply system was not ready. The French railways had been hammered by Allied bombing before and after D-Day to prevent German movement. That destruction now punished the liberators too. Ports that mattered were damaged, blocked, or not yet usable at full capacity. Cherbourg had to be rebuilt. Antwerp, though captured later, would not immediately solve the problem. The beaches and depots in Normandy were still the great rearward lungs of the Allied armies. So the answer became trucks. Thousands of them. Trucks would run day and night. Trucks would carry fuel, ammunition, rations, and parts. Trucks would use reserved roads. Military police would hold intersections. Signs marked with red balls would point the way. Drivers would push through fatigue until the human body itself became another consumable item in the campaign. To German officers, a truck convoy may not have inspired the same fear as a tank column. Trucks were vulnerable. Trucks needed roads. Trucks broke down. Trucks consumed the very fuel they carried. Trucks were driven by tired men who could make mistakes. On paper, the weaknesses were obvious. But war has a habit of punishing those who confuse obvious weakness with uselessness. The Germans believed distance would become their ally. The Allies answered by filling that distance with engines. And on those engines rode men who had not been trained for glory, but for movement. The German bet had been placed. Let them outrun themselves. Now the question was whether a road network built in haste could keep an army from collapsing under its own speed. The hidden front behind the front. The battlefield after Normandy did not end where the shooting stopped. It stretched backward across France in lines of dust and exhaust. It lived in supply dumps near beaches, in repair yards, in traffic posts, in depots where men loaded crates until their backs burned. It moved through villages where French civilians woke at night to the sound of trucks grinding past in endless sequence. It crossed bridges that engineers had patched in a hurry and roads that had never been meant to carry the weight of an industrial army. The maps in headquarters showed front lines. But behind those lines was another geography, less dramatic, less photographed, and just as decisive. An army consumes everything. Consumes fuel first because fuel is movement. A Sherman tank, a truck, a jeep, a self-propelled gun, a generator, a recovery vehicle. All of them drink from the same invisible river. When that river slows, operations slow with it. The front may still look strong to the eye, but commanders begin to feel the limit in every order they cannot give. Then ammunition, shells for artillery, small arms rounds, mortar bombs, tank rounds, machine gun belts, explosives, flares, grenades. War reduces metal into noise and smoke, then demands more metal. Then food and water. Men can be ordered forward hungry, but not indefinitely. Hunger changes judgment. Thirst changes discipline. Exhaustion changes courage into something brittle. Then spare parts, the least glamorous and often most cruel requirement of all. A broken fan belt, a cracked axle, a failed tire, a missing spark plug, a damaged fuel pump. None of these sound like historic forces. Yet each could stop a vehicle as surely as an enemy shell. A tank division is not made only of tanks. It is made of everything that allows tanks to remain tanks instead of becoming monuments. By late summer 1944, the Allied armies were advancing faster than the repaired infrastructure behind them. Rail lines were broken. Bridges were down. Road junctions were crowded. Supply dumps were too far west. The farther the armies moved, the more each delivery cost in time, fuel, maintenance, and driver endurance. The hidden problem was not that the Allies lacked supplies entirely. Mountains of material existed. The United States had built a war economy capable of producing almost unimaginable quantities of fuel, vehicles, ammunition, food, and equipment. The problem was position. A gallon of gasoline on a beach in Normandy did not help a tank near the German border unless someone moved it there. And every gallon moved forward required space, planning, manpower, and more fuel. That was the ugly arithmetic. A truck carrying fuel burned fuel while delivering fuel. A tire worn down by one trip might fail on the next. A driver who had completed one run was not suddenly rested because the front needed another. The supply system had to fight distance, road damage, weather, confusion, and time itself. Inside Allied command, there were arguments and pressures that rarely fit cleanly into popular memory. Which army should receive priority? Which advance mattered most? How much fuel should go to Patton? How much to Hodges? What about Montgomery's plans? What about ammunition reserves? What about the ports? What about the railways? Every gallon sent one way was a gallon not sent another. The front was not only a line. It was a demand. This is where the Red Ball Express entered the story not as a convenience, but as an emergency response to a dangerous imbalance. The combat units had created a victory faster than the supply system could comfortably support. The answer was not elegant. It was to take roads, trucks, drivers, military police, mechanics, loaders, and dispatchers, and drive supplies forward with almost punishing intensity. Men in trucks became the connective tissue of the campaign. They moved through areas that had recently been battlefields. They passed wrecked German vehicles on the roadside, burned out houses, fields torn by shellfire, bridges repaired with temporary spans, crossroads marked by signs and dust. Sometimes they drove through towns where civilians waved. Sometimes through places too tired to wave. Sometimes the only audience was another driver's face, pale with fatigue, seen for a moment through a dirty windshield. The hidden front had its own discipline. Military police kept traffic moving. A stopped convoy could become a clot in the artery. Mechanics cannibalized parts, patched engines, changed tires, and sent trucks back onto roads before any peacetime standard would have called them ready. Depot workers loaded and unloaded with speed that sacrificed neatness. Drivers pushed beyond normal limits because normal limits belonged to another world. They believed the real war was at the front. What really happened was that the front depended on men who might never see the enemy clearly. A rifleman knew when he was in combat. A tank crew knew when a shell struck near them. A pilot knew when tracers rose into the sky. But a Red Ball driver existed in a strange borderland. He was behind the front, yet not safe. He was not attacking, yet the attack depended on him. He was not supposed to be celebrated, yet the failure of his mission could silence entire units. That contradiction sat in every truck cab. The driver did not need to understand global strategy. He knew the cargo had to arrive. He knew the route. He knew the rules. He knew he was tired. And he knew one more thing, even if no one said it aloud. If the trucks stopped, the war stopped with them. The men nobody put in the victory photographs. The men of the Red Ball Express did not enter France as the kind of soldiers war posters preferred. Many were service troops, quartermaster men, drivers, loaders, mechanics, dispatchers, military police, men whose work was described in verbs that sounded plain. Haul, repair, direct, load, unload, refuel, move. A great number were Black American soldiers serving in an army that still separated men by race even while claiming to fight for freedom abroad. They wore the uniform. They worked under military discipline. They crossed dangerous roads and carried the weight of a campaign. Yet the society that sent them to war did not grant them equal standing, and often the army did not either. That tension cannot be removed from the story without making the story false. For many of these men, the Red Ball Express was not only a test of endurance. It was service under contradiction. They were expected to perform with discipline, courage, and stamina, while moving through a military system that often underestimated them or confined them to support roles. They were trusted with the lifeblood of armies, but not always with the respect given to combat units. And still they drove. Some were young enough to still carry boyhood in their faces. Some had been mechanics before the war. Some learned engines in the army because the army needed hands more than resumes. Some had never seen France before the campaign turned them into night drivers on foreign roads. They learned quickly that the truck was not simply a vehicle. It was shelter, workplace, burden, and risk. A driver's world was narrow. The wheel, the gear shift, the windshield, the truck ahead, the sound of the engine, the road surface, the fear of falling asleep. The knowledge that a sharp turn taken too fast could throw the load. The knowledge that gasoline did not forgive fire. The mechanics lived under a different pressure. A truck that broke down did not merely represent a failed machine. It represented cargo not delivered, a route obstructed. Another truck pulled aside. Another delay passed forward like a tremor through the system. Mechanics worked in mud, dust, rain, and darkness. Their hands were cut by metal and blackened by oil. A proper repair might take too long, so they made the repair that would get the vehicle moving. Good enough was not laziness. Sometimes it was the only possible form of survival. Military police stood at intersections where a wrong turn could waste hours. They controlled traffic that could not be allowed to become confusion. Their authority was practical. A convoy had to move. A road had to remain clear. An argument at a crossroads could cost more than pride. Loaders handled cargo with speed and risk. Ammunition was weight with consequences. Fuel cans leaked. Crates splintered. Men learned how to move fast without thinking too long about what would happen if something dropped, sparked, shifted, or crushed a hand. These were not background figures. They were the human machinery inside the logistical machine. Yet their work rarely produced the kind of single dramatic moment that history likes to preserve. There was no one hill taken by the Red Ball Express. No one bridge seized under fire that could contain the whole meaning. His achievement was repetition. A run completed. Then another. Then another. Convoy arrived. A depot emptied. A frontline dump filled. A tank refueled. An artillery battery resupplied. A division moved. Repetition is difficult to honor because it does not always look like drama from a distance. But from inside the cab, repetition could feel like punishment. A man drives through the night, unloads, turns around, drives back, waits, loads, drives again. His body asks for sleep. The schedule refuses. The war does not care that his hands ache, that his eyes sting, that his back has gone stiff, that he has begun to hear the engine even when it is off. He is not asked whether he feels heroic. He is asked whether the truck can move. This is where the underdog nature of the Red Ball Express becomes clear. The drivers and support crews were not underestimated because their task was easy. They were underestimated because their task looked ordinary. Driving a truck was familiar. Loading supplies was familiar. Changing tires was familiar. But scale changes the meaning of ordinary things. A single truck is transport. Thousands of trucks under military pressure become operational power. A driver is a driver. Thousands of exhausted drivers sustaining an army across France become the reason armored divisions do not freeze in place. A mechanic replacing a part is maintenance. A mechanic doing it fast enough to keep the route alive becomes part of a battlefield decision. They believed these men were support. What really happened was that support became the difference between pursuit and paralysis. And the idea that made it possible was almost crude in its simplicity. Take roads, reserve them, mark them, police them, and force supplies forward day and night. On paper, it was a route. In practice, it became a weapon. A road system built like a weapon. The Red Ball Express was not beautiful. It was improvised, pressured, overworked, and always close to failure. It relied on machines that broke, men who needed sleep, roads that were damaged, and a supply-demand that grew faster than planners wanted to admit. But it had one advantage. It moved. The idea was direct. Create a priority truck route from the supply areas in Normandy toward the forward armies. Mark the roads. Restrict traffic. Send loaded trucks one way and empty trucks back another. Keep the convoys flowing. Do not let ordinary movement interfere with emergency movement. Build, in effect, a bloodstream out of roads. The red ball signs gave the system its name and its visual identity. They told drivers and military police that this route had priority. The markings were simple enough to be understood quickly, and in war, simplicity can be more valuable than elegance. A tired driver did not need a complex explanation at a fork in the road. He needed to know which way meant forward. Yet the simplicity hid the strain. Trucks had to be found. Drivers had to be assigned. Cargo had to be prioritized. Depots had to feed the route. Military police had to keep intersections clear. Maintenance crews had to keep vehicles alive. Commanders had to decide what mattered most. Fuel, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, spare parts. Everything mattered. Not everything could arrive first. The system also consumed itself. A truck carrying gasoline to the front burned gasoline to get there. A convoy that delivered supplies also wore tires, engines, brakes, transmissions, and drivers. The more the system succeeded, the more it was asked to do. Success created expectation. Expectation created pressure. Pressure created breakdown. There were reasons to doubt it. A railroad could move far more tonnage with far less fuel per ton. A functioning port closer to the front would be better. A repaired bridge network would be better. Pipelines would help. Better road discipline would help. Better rest cycles would help. Better maintenance schedules would help. Almost everything about the Red Ball Express could be criticized because it was not the ideal solution. But the ideal solution was not available at the moment when the armies needed supplies. War often forces men to choose between a flawed answer now and a perfect answer too late. The Red Ball Express was the flawed answer now. The route became a controlled emergency. Convoys moved under rules that were strict because disorder could kill the system. Speed mattered, but not reckless speed. Spacing mattered. Direction mattered. Priority mattered. A truck that wandered into the wrong road could waste fuel and time. A civilian cart, a stray military jeep, a stalled vehicle, a confused column, all could slow the artery. Military police became guardians of movement. Their battlefield was the crossroads. Their weapons were signals, authority, maps, and discipline. They stood in dust by day and darkness by night, waving trucks through, stopping unauthorized traffic, forcing order onto roads that wanted to become chaos. Drivers learned the rhythm of the route. Load, move, deliver, return, repeat. They learned the sound of engines under strain. They learned how a truck felt when it was overloaded. They learned what a bad tire sounded like before it failed. They learned the particular dread of descending a road with weak brakes and too much weight behind them. The cargo itself carried tension. Fuel was essential but dangerous. Ammunition was essential but unforgiving. Rations were less dramatic, but hunger could hollow out a unit. Spare parts might look insignificant until one missing component stopped a vehicle that an entire mission required. The Germans had mocked, or at least underestimated, the idea that supply trucks could preserve operational momentum across such distance. Many in all armies had inherited the old instinct that combat arms decided wars while logistics followed behind. But the Red Ball Express blurred that separation. The road was behind the front, yet it shaped the front. The trucks were not firing, yet their cargo determined who could. Still, a weapon built from roads and tired men had weaknesses no map could hide. Could be slowed by weather, broken by congestion, damaged by accidents, starved by its own fuel needs, worn down by maintenance failure, undone by exhaustion. And exhaustion was everywhere. In the eyes of the drivers, in the bent backs of loaders, in the hands of mechanics, in the impatience of officers waiting at supply points, in the silence of men who had been awake too long and no longer wasted words. The road system looked bold from above. At ground level, it was a test of nerve repeated mile after mile. And once the trucks began moving through darkness with blacked-out lights and overloaded cargo beds, the theory of the Red Ball Express met the reality of the French roads. That was where the real danger began. No sleep, no lights, no margin for error. A Red Ball run did not begin with drama. It began with waiting. A truck sat in line at a depot while men moved around it with clipboards, crates, fuel cans, shouted instructions, and the dull impatience of too much work. The driver might climb down, stretch his legs, check the tires, wipe the windshield, look under the hood, and listen to the engine as if it might confess a problem before the road exposed it. Around him, other trucks idled or coughed to life. Men smoked. Someone swore at a jammed tailgate. Somewhere metal struck wood. Somewhere a sergeant wanted the line moving faster. The cargo came aboard. Fuel cans, ammunition crates, rations, spare parts, whatever the front had demanded and the depot could release. The load might not sit perfectly. War rarely allows perfect loading. Men tied it down, checked it, tightened it, then checked it again because a shifting load on a bad road could kill. Then the convoy formed. The driver climbed back into the cab. The seat was hard. The air smelled of canvas and oil. The windshield might already be dirty before the first mile. When the order came, the line moved out with a low mechanical growl, one truck after another, heavy and necessary. By day, dust became the enemy. It rose from the road and hung in the air until trucks seemed to drive inside a brown-gray fog of their own making. Coated faces, uniforms, gauges, maps, windshields, lips and teeth. Drivers squinted through it. Men learned the shape of the vehicle ahead more than its details. A sudden stop could appear too late. By night, the dust gave way to darkness. Blackout driving demanded discipline that fought every human instinct. A driver wants to see. He wants full headlights, clear distance, warning. Instead, he gets slits of light, dim markers, shadow, memory, and trust. The road narrows. Trees lean close. A bridge appears only when the truck is almost on it. The vehicle ahead becomes a suggestion. The world beyond the windshield disappears. Fatigue did not arrive all at once. Crept in. First the eyes burned. Then the shoulders tightened. Then thoughts became slower. The engine's rhythm began to hypnotize. A man might shake his head, slap his cheek, roll his neck, open the window, breathe in cold air, anything to stay present. He might speak aloud to no one. He might count seconds. He might stare at the dim rear of the truck ahead as if staring alone could keep him alive. The punishment for a moment's sleep could be immediate. A truck drifting off the road might overturn. A convoy might pile up behind it. Fuel might spill. Ammunition might scatter. Men could be trapped, burned, crushed, or thrown into darkness before anyone had time to shout a warning. Enemy action was not absent. German aircraft, artillery, saboteurs, and scattered troops could threaten supply movement in certain areas, especially closer to unstable zones. But much of the red ball danger came from something less cinematic and more relentless. Operating a heavy transport system beyond normal endurance. Trucks were overloaded. Roads were imperfect. Maintenance was rushed. Drivers were exhausted. A brake failure did not care whether the Luftwaffe was overhead. A blown tire did not wait for daylight. A driver's body did not become stronger because the front needed him. Mechanics fought their own version of the campaign. When trucks limped back or stopped along the route, they crawled under them, opened hoods, changed tires, patched what could be patched. A proper workshop was a luxury. The route needed speed. A repair that could survive one more run might be accepted because one more run mattered. There was an intimacy to mechanical failure. A man knew the smell of overheated brakes. He knew the sound of a misfiring engine. He knew when a truck was wrong before he could prove it. He also knew that pointing out a problem could delay cargo the front was waiting for. So judgment became difficult. Can it make one more trip? That question sat inside the Red Ball Express like a hidden fuse. Can the truck make one more trip? Can the driver? Can the tires? Can the route? Can the whole emergency system endure one more day? The Germans believed Allied logistics would break because such pressure could not continue indefinitely. In one sense, they were not foolish. The Red Ball Express was not magic. It was not limitless. It did damage itself by operating at such intensity. It burned fuel, wore out vehicles, consumed manpower, and pushed men near collapse. But the German error was in timing. They needed the Allied supply system to fail before German forces lost the chance to recover. They needed the roads to jam, the trucks to stop, the fuel to run dry, the armored units to sit motionless long enough for a defensive line to harden. Instead, through dust, darkness, and exhaustion, enough trucks kept arriving. Not all, never all, but enough. Enough to keep pressure on retreating German formations. Enough to keep forward units alive. Enough to prevent the silence of empty fuel tanks from spreading everywhere at once. Every arrival at a forward supply point was small by itself. A truck backed in. Men unloaded. Fuel cans came down. Crates hit the ground. Signatures were taken or ignored in the rush. The driver turned around. But multiplied thousands of times, those small arrivals became an operational fact German commanders could not wish away. The road was hurting the men who used it. The road was wearing out the trucks that ran it. But the road was still open. And as long as it stayed open, the German hope that the Allied advance would starve began to weaken mile by mile. The moment German assumptions began to break. The German army in France was not defeated by trucks alone. No serious account should pretend that it was. German formations were being hit by Allied infantry, armor, artillery, air power, intelligence, resistance activity, and the accumulated consequences of years of war. They were retreating after a brutal campaign that had drained men and machines. Their command structure was under pressure from every direction. But logistics decides how pressure is sustained. A single attack can break a line. Supply determines whether the attacker can keep moving after the line breaks. This was where German assumptions began to fail. They had expected Allied speed to create Allied weakness. And it did create weakness. The Allied pursuit was not smooth. Fuel shortages were real. Armored units paused. Commanders argued over allocation. Some opportunities narrowed because gasoline did not arrive in time. The Red Ball Express did not erase the supply crisis. It fought the crisis with engines, manpower, and urgency. But from the German side, the expected collapse did not come in the form they needed. Again and again, Allied units that should have been immobilized found enough fuel to move. Artillery that could have fallen silent received ammunition. Infantry that might have outrun rations continued forward. A truck column appeared where German logic had expected delay. A dump was filled. A tank was refueled. Another advance resumed. This must have been difficult to see clearly in the chaos of retreat. German officers did not sit calmly watching the Red Ball Express as a complete system. They saw fragments. Continued Allied pressure, roads threatened from the air, fuel shortages in their own units, wrecked vehicles, collapsing communications, orders that arrived late or not at all. But over time, the pattern mattered. The Allies were strained. The Germans were starving. Not always literally at first, though hunger existed. Starving in the military sense meant lacking what an army needed to act. Fuel, ammunition, transport, replacement vehicles, time, coherent routes. When a German unit had guns but not enough shells, it was starving. When it had tanks but no fuel, it was starving. When orders demanded movement but trucks and horses could not sustain it, it was starving. When retreat destroyed supply dumps and Allied aircraft punished road movement, the hunger deepened. There is a particular cruelty in watching the enemy suffer the problem you expected to destroy him. German commanders understood supply. That may have made the realization worse. They knew what it meant when units reported fuel shortages. They knew what abandoned vehicles signified. They knew that a formation without mobility could be outmaneuvered, bypassed, encircled, or forced to retreat on foot. They knew that ammunition shortages turned defensive plans into wishes. Allied supply was imperfect, but German supply was becoming desperate. The Red Ball Express contributed to that reversal by preserving Allied tempo. Tempo is not only speed. It is the ability to act before the enemy can stabilize. A tired German unit might plan to form a line, only to find Allied pressure arriving sooner than expected. A retreating column might hope for a pause, only to hear artillery again. A commander might assume the Americans must be out of fuel, only to face tanks whose fuel had arrived in cans unloaded by men who would never be named in his reports. What they believed was that distance would weaken the attacker. What really happened was that distance became a battlefield the Allies were willing to brutalize themselves to cross. Still, the reversal was not clean. The Allied armies did slow. The supply crisis remained severe. By September, the limits of truck-based logistics became impossible to ignore. The farther the front moved, the harder every delivery became. The Red Ball Express was astonishing, but it was also a stopgap. It could not replace ports, railroads, pipelines, and a fully restored logistical network forever. That matters because it keeps the story honest. The Red Ball Express did not create effortless victory. It bought time, movement, and pressure at great cost. It kept the pursuit alive long enough to exploit German disorganization, but it could not abolish geography. In headquarters, the numbers grew heavier. More miles. More fuel consumed delivering fuel. More trucks needing repair. More tires worn out. More drivers exhausted. More demands from armies that all believed their need was urgent. The Germans had been wrong to think the Allied supply line would simply snap. But the Allies could not ignore the strain forever. The Red Ball Express had broken one assumption, but another hard truth was waiting behind it. Even the most determined emergency system has a limit, and that limit is written in mathematics. The mathematics of momentum. War is often remembered through moments. A landing craft ramp dropping. A tank entering a town. A flag raised. A bridge seized. A city burning at night. But beneath those moments are numbers. Not clean numbers. Not numbers that remove fear or suffering. Numbers that explain why courage sometimes moves and sometimes cannot. The Red Ball Express lived inside those numbers. A truck could carry only so much. A driver could stay awake only so long. A tire could survive only so many miles. A gallon of gasoline could move a vehicle only a certain distance. An armored division required a vast daily weight of fuel, ammunition, rations, and maintenance support. The farther that division moved from its supply base, the more expensive every mile became. Reports and post-war accounts give different ways of measuring the Red Ball Express, but the broad shape is clear: thousands of trucks, thousands of drivers, and enormous daily tonnage moved across France during the emergency period from late August into November 1944. Some records indicate that at its peak, the system delivered several thousand tons of supplies per day. The exact figure matters, but what matters more is what the figure reveals. The Red Ball Express was not a convenience. It was a massive act of forced circulation. Think of fuel alone. A tank waiting at the front needs gasoline. That gasoline must be loaded into cans or containers, placed on trucks, driven across long distances, unloaded, distributed, and poured into vehicles. But the truck delivering it uses fuel during the trip. If the route grows longer, the delivery becomes less efficient. At some point, a supply system begins to feed on itself. That was one of the central tensions of the Red Ball Express. It was solving a fuel crisis by burning fuel. This sounds absurd until the alternative is considered. If the fuel stays in Normandy, the tanks stop. If the tanks stop, German units gain time. If German units gain time, they form defenses, destroy bridges, withdraw equipment, and make the next battle more expensive. Fuel burned by trucks might save lives if it preserved momentum. Waste and necessity became difficult to separate. Ammunition carried the same logic. An artillery battery could fire in minutes what had taken long labor to produce, ship, unload, store, reload, and drive forward. A crate on a truck might represent hours of factory work and days or weeks of movement across oceans and depots. At the front, it could vanish into smoke in seconds. Spare parts were even stranger. A small part might weigh little compared to fuel or shells, yet its absence could immobilize a vehicle worth many times more. A truck loaded with parts did not look dramatic. But if one of those parts returned a tank, gun, or truck to use, its importance became enormous. The mathematics of survival in mechanized war is full of such disproportions. Small objects decide large movements. Tire, a belt, a bearing, a fuel can, a map, a working radio, a bridge sign, a driver awake enough to take the correct turn. Commanders spoke in divisions, but divisions were built out of these small dependencies. German officers knew this too. Their own army was suffering from the failure of small dependencies everywhere. Not enough fuel, not enough trucks, not enough spare parts, not enough time to repair, not enough safe movement under Allied air superiority. The Allied advantage was not that they escaped logistics. No army escapes logistics. The advantage was that the Allies could improvise an answer on a scale Germany increasingly could not match. But numbers do not carry themselves. Behind every ton delivered were bodies in motion. Men lifting, men driving, men repairing, men standing watch, men forcing themselves through another hour. The mathematics of momentum eventually returned to human limits. If a driver slept 2 hours instead of 6, The numbers improved on paper and worsened inside his head. If a truck skipped a full maintenance check, it returned to the route faster and became more likely to fail. If a convoy pushed harder, supplies arrived sooner and accidents became more probable. The system converted human endurance into operational reach. That is a cold sentence. On the road, it meant a man with burning eyes gripping a wheel in darkness because a column of tanks somewhere ahead might move tomorrow if he did not end up in a ditch tonight. The Germans believed Allied momentum would collapse under arithmetic. What really happened was that Allied logistics bent the arithmetic violently, temporarily, and at a cost. The Red Ball Express did not defeat mathematics. It borrowed against exhaustion, and the bill came due along the roads. The cost paid in ditches, flames, and silence. A successful supply line leaves strange evidence. Not always captured ground. Not always enemy prisoners. Sometimes its evidence is absence. The attack did not stall, the guns did not go silent, the tanks did not remain empty, the men did not go hungry that day. But the road itself remembered more. It remembered the trucks that did not finish the run. The ones that slipped off shoulders, broke axles, overturned, burned, or sat waiting for parts that could not arrive quickly enough. It remembered the drivers who climbed down shaking, not from enemy fire, but from the private terror of nearly falling asleep at the wheel. It remembered mechanics lying under vehicles in dirt and oil. It remembered men who became quiet because they were too tired to speak. There is a temptation to describe the Red Ball Express only in terms of achievement. Tonnage delivered, miles driven, armies supplied, momentum preserved. Those things are true, but achievement in war is rarely clean. The cost appeared in accidents, injuries, mechanical exhaustion, and psychological strain. It appeared in the way men were used by a system that could not pause long enough to care for them properly. It appeared in racial injustice, black soldiers doing essential work while serving under segregation, their contribution too often minimized by the same nation that depended on it. Some drivers faced enemy danger. Others faced roads that were danger enough. A truck loaded with fuel did not need a bomb to become deadly. A spark, a crash, a rollover, a collision in darkness. Any of these could turn cargo into flame. Ammunition trucks carried their own threat. Even rations and spare parts, harmless in theory, became lethal when stacked high on a vehicle moving too fast on a poor road under a driver who had slept too little. The men learned to live with risk that did not always announce itself. A combat soldier might hear incoming fire. A Red Ball driver might hear only the steady drone of his own engine until the moment the truck ahead appeared too close. Then brakes. A shout. Metal. Darkness. Silence broken by someone calling for help. Not every death in war comes with an enemy in sight. That fact gives the Red Ball Express much of its moral weight. These men were not outside the war. They were inside its machinery. The machine needed them, consumed them, and often forgot them. For black drivers, the contradiction followed them through the campaign. In France, some encountered civilians who saw the uniform before the color line. In the U.S. Army, segregation remained a daily fact. They carried fuel to units that might receive glory they would never share equally. They helped preserve a liberation campaign while not fully free in the society they served. No narration should flatten that into sentiment. It was not an inspirational slogan. It was a wound, and still the work continued. A driver did not have to resolve the contradictions of democracy and segregation before taking the next load forward. A mechanic did not have to be publicly honored before changing the tire. A military policeman did not have to believe history would remember him before standing at the crossroads again. They did what the war required. That phrase can sound noble from a distance. Up close, it is heavier. Doing what the war required meant ignoring fatigue until fatigue became dangerous. It meant taking a truck back onto the route when a civilian would have refused the vehicle. It meant eating quickly, sleeping badly, and measuring life in runs completed. It meant watching another man disappear from the convoy and not always knowing what happened to him. The human cost did not negate the achievement. It made the achievement real. A clean legend would say the Red Ball Express roared across France and fed the Allied armies. A truer account says it did so through strain, waste, courage, discrimination, breakdown, improvisation, and sacrifice. The Germans saw the result more than the cost. They saw Allied pressure continuing. They saw American forces still able to move. They saw fuel and ammunition reaching places where logic suggested shortages should bite harder. They saw their own units increasingly deprived of the ability to answer. They did not see every driver fighting sleep. They did not see every mechanic's hands. They did not see every quiet moment after a crash. The official record would remember tonnage more easily than trembling hands on a steering wheel. And that is why recognition, when it came unevenly, measured first in reports and only later in memory. Recognition that arrived too late. Armies are good at recording quantities. Tons delivered, miles covered, trucks assigned, fuel consumed, vehicles repaired, dates opened and closed, units served, routes marked, operational periods defined. These records matter. Without them, the Red Ball Express becomes only atmosphere, and atmosphere is not enough. The numbers show scale. They prove that the operation was not a myth built from a few dramatic convoys. It was a sustained emergency system that helped keep Allied armies moving during one of the most demanding phases of the campaign in Western Europe. But armies are less reliable at recording dignity. They can describe what was moved and when. They can analyze bottlenecks. They can praise efficiency, identify waste, and recommend improvements. Yet the men who carried the burden often remain blurred together: truck drivers, service troops, quartermaster personnel, military police, mechanics. Necessary categories. Poor memorials. After the war, commanders and historians recognized the importance of logistics in the European campaign. They had to. The evidence was too large to ignore. The pursuit across France, the supply crisis, the dependence on truck transport, the eventual need for better ports and railways, these became part of the serious military discussion. But public memory moved differently. Public memory preferred the visible instruments of victory. Tanks entering towns, infantry in ruined streets, paratroopers in doorways, fighters and bombers in formation, generals at map tables. Those images have power because they are real, but they are incomplete. The Red Ball Express sat behind them like a shadow. Many Americans knew the name. Fewer understood the strain. Fewer still understood the racial reality of the men who made much of it work. Black soldiers who had delivered fuel and ammunition across France returned to a country still shaped by segregation, discrimination, and violence. Their wartime service did not automatically grant them the equality their labor had earned. Some recognition came in military histories, some in veteran accounts, some in later documentaries, museums, and commemorations. Over time, the phrase Red Ball Express became better known as a symbol of wartime logistics and black military service. But recognition delayed is not the same as recognition given when the men could most feel its weight. There is a quiet cruelty in being essential and invisible. To be essential means the system fails without you. To be invisible means the story is told as if the system moved by itself. No truck drove itself across France. No fuel can load it itself. No tire changed itself. No intersection cleared itself. No convoy remained disciplined by accident. Behind every delivery record were men making decisions under pressure, often without the luxury of being remembered individually. The Allied command did learn from the experience. The Red Ball Express revealed both the power and limits of emergency motor transport. It showed that dedicated routes, traffic control, priority systems, and mass trucking could preserve movement under crisis. It also showed that trucks could not replace a complete logistics network forever. Ports, railways, pipelines, depots, maintenance systems, and rested manpower mattered. The lesson was not that trucks solved everything. The lesson was that logistics must be treated as combat power before the crisis arrives, not after. German commanders had understood logistics as a vulnerability. The Allies proved it could also become a strength if supplied by industrial depth and human endurance. That realization shaped how the campaign was studied afterward, and how modern militaries thought about sustainment, mobility, and operational reach. Still, the delayed recognition leaves an unfinished feeling. The drivers were not asking to become legends. Most soldiers do not think in those terms while the war is happening. They want to live. They want their friends to live. They want the job done. They want to sleep. They want the truck to start. They want the road to end. But history has obligations the moment itself does not. It must look behind the famous images. It must ask who made them possible. It must follow the fuel line backward, from the tank to the truck, from the truck to the depot, from the depot to the ship, from the ship to the factory, from the factory to the workers, and then forward again into battle. When it does, the Red Ball Express no longer appears as a footnote. It appears as a warning against misunderstanding war. The thing that looks secondary may be central. The men placed behind the front may be carrying the front on their backs. The weapon that does not fire may decide whether weapons can fire at all. And what began as an emergency route across France became something larger. A lesson in how modern war truly moves. The legacy of a moving supply line. The Red Ball Express ended because it was never meant to last forever. By November 1944, the emergency system that had helped sustain the Allied pursuit had given way to changing conditions. Railways were being repaired. Ports and depots were reorganized. Other supply methods expanded. The front had shifted. The campaign had entered a different phase, slower, harsher, and closer to Germany's borders. But the meaning of the Red Ball Express did not end with the route. Its legacy was not simply that trucks delivered supplies across France. Armies had used trucks before. The deeper lesson was about tempo, the relationship between movement, supply, and enemy recovery. An army that moves quickly but cannot sustain itself creates a temporary spectacle. It may frighten the enemy for a day, perhaps a week. Then it stops. Once it stops, the enemy breathes. Bridges are blown. Lines are formed. Guns are dug in. Reserves are shifted. A pursuit becomes a battle. A battle becomes a siege. Lives are spent buying ground that speed might have taken earlier. The Red Ball Express helped keep that pause from arriving too soon. It showed that logistics could be used offensively. Not offensively in the sense of firing weapons, but in the sense of preserving pressure. Every truckload of fuel was not just supply. It was time denied to the enemy. Every ammunition delivery was not just stock. It was the ability to continue shaping the battlefield. Every spare part was not just maintenance. It was a vehicle returned to movement. Modern armies understand this more openly now. Sustainment is not an afterthought. Convoy security, fuel distribution, maintenance, transport prioritization, route control, traffic discipline, forward supply points, repair capacity, these are not background details. They determine how far combat power can reach and how long it can remain dangerous. The Red Ball Express made that truth visible under stress. It also revealed the limits of improvisation. A heroic emergency cannot become a permanent substitute for planning. Men pushed too long make mistakes. Vehicles overworked too hard fail. Routes overloaded too heavily clog. A logistics system built in crisis may perform miracles for a time, but miracles are expensive. That is one of the reasons the story still matters. It refuses easy conclusions. The Red Ball Express was brilliant and flawed, necessary and wasteful, inspiring and punishing. It helped defeat German expectations while exposing Allied weaknesses. It relied on men the system did not fully honor. It preserved momentum while damaging the people and machines that made momentum possible. War is often like that. The truth sits in contradiction. For the German army, the lesson arrived too late. They had believed that Allied supply lines would become the great weakness of the pursuit. Instead, Allied logistics, strained, noisy, imperfect, and immense, helped keep pressure on German forces while German supply collapsed under retreat, air attack, fuel shortage, and disorder. For the Allies, the lesson was also uncomfortable. Victory required not only bold generals and brave combat troops, but a vast rear area of labor, much of it performed by men whose names would not be celebrated. It required accepting that the battlefield was larger than the battlefield. A road in France could be as important as a ridge. A fuel can could matter as much as a shell. A driver fighting sleep could influence the timing of an attack he would never witness. The legacy of the Red Ball Express lives in that enlarged understanding of war. It asks the viewer to look at a convoy and see more than vehicles, to see decision, pressure, inequality, endurance, and the hidden architecture of victory. It also changes the way we read the famous images of 1944. When a tank rolls through a liberated town, somewhere behind it there is fuel. When artillery fires, somewhere behind it there are shells. When infantry advances, somewhere behind it there are rations, bandages, boots, batteries, and trucks. When a commander draws an arrow on a map, somewhere behind that arrow is a road full of men trying to make the arrow real. That is the final legacy. Not a myth of flawless logistics, but a recognition that modern war is sustained by people who often stand outside the frame. And so the story returns to the dark road, the hooded headlights, the gasoline cans, and the driver trying to stay awake. Because the truth of the Red Ball Express is not only found in its statistics. It is found in the small human moments that made the statistics possible. What they believed, what really happened. Return to the road outside Chartres. The hour is still early. The darkness still presses against the windshield. The driver's hands are still on the wheel. The truck ahead is still a dim shape, appearing and disappearing through dust and night. Behind him, gasoline cans knock softly against one another. Each sound small enough to ignore, unless you understand what those cans mean. They mean movement. They mean tanks that may start again. Guns that may fire again. Men who may eat. Engines that may not remain silent. A front that may continue pressing east before the enemy can rebuild his strength. Nothing about the scene looks grand. There is no speech, no flag, no clean composition for a monument. Just a tired man, a loaded truck, a dangerous road, and a war that has reduced strategy to the question of whether he can stay awake long enough to arrive. The Germans believed the Allied advance would outrun itself. They believed distance would do what German defenses could not yet do. They believed fuel shortages, broken railways, damaged ports, and exhausted roads would slow the Allied armies until the retreating German forces could recover. They were not foolish to believe this. War had taught them that logistics could destroy ambition. They had seen machines stop for lack of fuel. They had seen great plans shrink under mud, distance, weather, and shortage. They knew that no army moves on courage alone. But what really happened in France was harsher, stranger, and more human. The Allies did suffer from distance. They did run short. They did pause. They did argue over fuel. Their logistics did strain and bend under pressure. The Red Ball Express did not create a smooth road to victory. It created a rough road that could be used before better answers existed. And that was enough to matter. Enough trucks arrived. Enough fuel reached forward. Enough ammunition moved. Enough parts were delivered. Enough exhausted men forced enough machines across enough miles to keep the pursuit alive when the enemy needed it to fail. That is the power of the story. The Red Ball Express was not glamorous, but glamour has never been the measure of importance. It was not perfect, but perfection is rare in war and often arrives too late. It was not gentle on the men who ran it, and any honest memory of it must include the fatigue, the accidents, the discrimination, the breakdowns, the fear, and the silence after the crashes. The drivers were not symbols to themselves. They were men doing work. Some were angry. Some were proud. Some were frightened. Some were too tired to feel much of anything except the need to keep the truck on the road. Many came from a country that asked them to help defeat tyranny while denying them equality at home. They served anyway, not because the contradiction disappeared, but because the war placed the burden before them and they carried it. The mechanics carried it in their hands, the loaders in their backs, the military police in their long hours at crossroads, the dispatchers in their schedules, the drivers in their eyes, burning from dust and lack of sleep. History often remembers the moment a weapon fires. The Red Ball Express asks us to remember the moment before that, when the shell is still in a crate, the fuel still in a can, the part still wrapped in grease paper, the truck still miles away, the driver still awake only because he has to be. The Germans believed the Allied armies would starve at the end of their own supply lines. But what really happened was that an army of overlooked men turned roads into arteries, trucks into instruments of pressure, and ordinary cargo into the difference between movement and defeat. They mocked the trucks because trucks looked ordinary. They understood too late that ordinary things, multiplied by urgency and driven by exhausted men, can become decisive. And in war, reality does not need to look impressive. It only needs to arrive before the enemy is ready. Final CTA. If you are watching from a place connected to this history, Europe, America, or anywhere a family memory of the war still survives, share where you are watching from in the comments. And if someone in your family served, whether in combat, transport, industry, medicine, or any forgotten corner of the war effort, you are welcome to leave their story below. For more forgotten World War II stories, the decisions, mistakes, machines, and ordinary people behind what really happened, subscribe to WW2 Combat Files.